How far will it go between Mali and France? Bamako summoning the former colonial powers ambassador after Emmanuel Macron again blasted the junta for deflecting from what the French president sees as the military's own lack of governance there. From the second coup inside of a year in Mali to Paris's decision to draw down part of its 5,000 troops it has stationed in the fight against a jihadist insurgency, there's been an escalating war of words that went into overdrive 2 weeks ago when Mali's prime minister at the UN accused France of abandoning his country. Then there's last Thursday's delivery of 4 Russian helicopters, just as France had buried with full honors its 52nd soldier killed in action in Mali. 52 killed since 2013. Paris warning it won't stick around if the junta agrees to hire Wagner, the same private security firm that's accused of human rights abuses in another former French colony, the Central African Republic. Why Wagner? How serious are the Malians about ditching French support for Russia? Where would that leave African, European, and UN forces also implicated in the fight against the insurgency, and particularly in neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger, which are increasingly the target of the same radicals? And what's President Macron's next move? Macron, who last week had his ambassador to neighboring Algeria summoned amid a different row involving France and one of its former colonies. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking how far will it go between Bamako and Paris. With us, retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military mission to the United Nations.
Good evening.
Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Niagalé Bagayoko, founder of the African Security Sector Network. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
From Oxford, Samuel Romani, researcher at Oxford University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And from London, Paul Melly, consulting fellow at the Africa program at the think tank Chatham House. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. Now, for now, they're still speaking, but Mali and France more than ever at loggerheads. Nick Rushworth has more.
Yet another blow to ties between Paris and Bamako. The Malian Foreign Ministry summoned the French ambassador in protest against the French president's criticism of Mali's army-dominated government led by Colonel Assimi Goïta. It did so after Emmanuel Macron called on Mali's ruling military to restore state authority.
The French army should not fill the void of the non-functioning of the Malian state. That must be restored. So in terms of the mission, we are refocusing geographically on the strict combating of terrorist groups.
Macron's criticism adds to tension last Thursday when he attacked remarks by the Malian Prime Minister, Choguel Kokala Maïga, at the UN General Assembly in New York, in which the Prime Minister accused France of abandoning Mali. The war of words between France and its former colony has come centre stage since it emerged that Bamako is in talks to recruit Russian mercenaries to tackle terrorism. Bamako received a delivery of Russian helicopters and weaponry last week at a time France was marking the death of a French soldier in Mali. France is currently in the process of a major scale-back of its Sahel deployment following the military takeover in Mali in August last year. Paris says despite the troop drawdown, it remains committed to the fight against jihadism in the Sahel.
Niagalé Bagayoko on the #F24 debate, a lot of blowback against France, saying, it's time for the French to leave anyway. You've been here too long. What has France brought us? What are your thoughts when you see how this row continues to escalate?
I think the situation is dramatically deteriorating has been dramatically deteriorating in the last weeks or so, but that in reality it's not a new situation because in my view the diplomatic relationships between France and Mali have been in crisis for at least 2 years. In my view, it was just before the famous Po summit that President Ibeka began to tell French that he wanted to enter into negotiation with some jihadi leaders following the recommendations of the National Inclusive Dialogues. And then all the other Malian authorities, even after the coups, the first civilian authority and then the other one, have continued on this pathway. Second, there has been this question of the coup with the condemnation of France, which was surprising after the kind of support, let's say, which happened in Chad. And finally, there is also a crisis regarding to the intention from Malian military authorities to make the military transition longer. So I think that the crisis is much deeper than what is happening today. And of course,
okay, so just to be clear for our viewers here, when we heard in that clip the French president saying, it's not for us to govern Mali, it's for the Malians to govern themselves. Does that mean that France's position has evolved when it comes to negotiating with some of those radical groups in the north of the country?
I think that the French position is still clear that there is absolutely no way to have negotiation with the leadership of some jihadi groups. But there have been some inflections as regards some dialogue with grassroots combatants. But I think that still this question will stay as a big problem between France and Mali, notwithstanding the fact that the Russian are maybe coming in.
Dominique Trinquant, today, does France mind if Bamako negotiates with some of the radical groups? After all, France is negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
It depends on what you're calling radical groups. I mean, it depends on the groups. If you discussing with the parents' organization of ACMI or Daesh, it's not possible because these are not focusing on Mali. They want to have a global revolution in the world. So we are a target, not only Mali. You've got groups which are using terrorist actions, but who just want to reorganize in Mali the balance of power, which is a different subject. And this is a subject for the Malian. But for the two other groups, I'm talking about the parents group from Daesh, to be simple. And ACMI, it is not possible. They are our enemy in France, in Europe, in the world.
Do you agree with Niagalé Bagayoko that the problems began when at that summit in southwestern France when Emmanuel Macron read the riot act basically to the regional leaders, including the now deposed former president of Mali?
No, but what's very interesting is that, in fact, and that's why you have two coups. In fact, the president of Niger said that instead of fighting, they made a coup inside Mali, and they wanted to change the governance in Mali instead of fighting, which is amazing because the people on the ground, I've got first reports on that, we've got no problem with the Malian army. I mean, we are working together. Currently, the French forces, as you know, are leaving the north of Mali, Kidal, Tessalit, and Tombouctou, in coordination with the Malian troops, because that was announced prior to the second coup. And probably the message was not passed between the first people in the first coup and the second coup, but it was announced to them and organized and in accordance with what the Malian wanted to.
Yeah, talk about parallel universes. On Tuesday, the same day that the French ambassador was being summoned, the head of the French military mission was in Bamako. He was saying that everything was going well. When it came to those outposts in the north, there you see on the map the cities of Timbuktu, Kidal, and Tessalit. The French focusing, they're redirecting their efforts now on the so-called three borders area you can see on the map, which is northeast of the capital. Militarily, the lines of communication remain open, says the commander of the French forces in Mali, General Laurent Michon.
Tomorrow, just like today, we will be able to come and support both MINUSMA and FAMA forces in Tessalit on very short notice.
Je rappelle quand même qu'il y a plusieurs centaines d'hommes de la MINUSMA.
There are several hundred men in the Tessalit camp if the threat is really strong. We have the possibility, which will remain completely unchanged and maintained in volume, to send fighters or air support to react and support the MINUSMA and FAMA forces in Tessalit.
Et appuyer ces forces MINUSMA et FAMA à Tessalit.
So, Paul Melly, clear the confusion, please. On the one hand, the two armies speaking to each other, no problem. And on the other hand, this war of words that, again, played out in part at the rostrum of the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks back.
Well, I think we've got several things going on in Bamako itself, in Malian politics and leadership at the same time. For a long time, there's been a strand of Malian political opinion, if you like, that's been quite vocally nationalistic and quite wary of France, but has also been very wary of the northern Tuareg autonomist groups. And we saw that even back in the original Mali coup back in 2012 and in its aftermath. And then you have quite a large strand in the military who are very much focused on pragmatic cooperation of the kind just referred to in that interview there. And let's not forget that in the aftermath of the first Mali coup last year, one of the first things that the coup leaders said was that they wanted to maintain the close military cooperation with France, with Barkhane operation, with the UN, and also with Takuba, the new European Special Forces operation, which is about to be combined with the French today. And then you have another chunk of the Mali political establishment who are more comfortable working with France, but who nevertheless still are aware of national sensitivities and the mood among ordinary Malians. They don't, of course, want to be seen to be pressured or pushed around by the former colonial power. And then around all this, we have the regional setting where other leaders in the G5 Sahel, that's the group of 5 Sahelian countries that are cooperating militarily with each other and with France in the battle against the jihadists. And some of those leaders, particularly the new president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum, and the president of Mauritania, President Ghazouani, they are much more comfortable dealing with France, and they've been publicly very supportive of the recalibration, if you like, of the French military effort and the Macron strategy. And in fact, just in the last few days, the president of Mauritania, Ghazouani, has given an interview in which he's basically said on the record that he's got concerns about the way that Mali is talking to the Russian military company Wagner, because in the G5 there should be consultation between all the members before those talks take place. And he's sort of basically come up with a strategic defense of the French strategy. So we've got these several different strands of opinion.
Okay, so Paul, let me ask you this.
Different groups of players, if you like, different attitudes.
Different groups of players, but let me ask you this. A, why did the Malian prime minister claim at the UN that France had abandoned Mali when it still is going to keep a presence of 4,000 troops there? And B, did Emmanuel Macron use the right language in that interview, that clip we heard at the top of the show?
I think both remarks illustrate the risks once people, for domestic political purposes, once they let that sort of domestic political language leak into the diplomatic public international arena, because you could see that Prime Minister Maiga, in his remarks at the UN, that was clearly, as it were, playing to the gallery of nationalist opinion back in Bamako, that strand of Malian opinion that I was talking about. And he admitted in a subsequent interview that he basically is well aware that France will be maintaining a significant military presence in the northeast of the country. So that was him sort of upping the nationalist language in public. And then President Macron, in return, again, feeling that he had to defend the French position. And of course, France had just lost a soldier, Sergeant Blanco, who'd just been killed. And he was juggling domestic French opinion and then coming out with this very strong public response, but which in the West African context risks causing offense. So in both cases, we could see politicians under pressure from domestic opinion, perhaps being a bit ill-judged in some of the language.
Samuel Romani, by the way, did you know that we're also having a presidential election here in this country in 6 months' time?
Yes, I did. Yeah, of course.
Your thoughts on whether that was a factor as well in the language used by Emmanuel Macron, or is Emmanuel Macron on the money here?
So obviously, the official French position has been consistently to denounce the military coups, the two of them that occurred, as to be extra legal and to be illegitimate. So the very fact that he would be trading barbs with Assimi Goïta and his compatriots is hardly a surprise given French policy. And when you look at the track record of French policy elsewhere in the region, whether it be the recent coup d'etat in Guinea that overthrew Alpha Condé, the French are similarly strident about that, even though Condé was a close partner of Russia. And it dates back to the coups that we saw between 2008 and 2010 across West Africa. So I don't think his language and his criticisms of this military regime are anything that new or anything that exceptional by French policy standards. And his willingness to combine the criticism of the way in which these officials took power with practical cooperation on the ground is completely understandable, because he wants to be very clear that the situation in the Sahel is not going to be another Afghanistan where the French withdraw and the European Standby Force and the African Union forces atrophy and militants reign supreme. So that combination of practical cooperation and castigation of the coup plotters is in line with this. Though some of the stridency of the language, I think his desire to kind of show that France had basically declared victory, like with the killing of the head of ISIS in West Africa last month, and moves like that, some of those symbolic gestures about withdrawing from Operation Barkhane could be aimed at appeasing the electorate, as well as some of the alarmist rhetoric about terrorism, too. Obviously, would be tied into trying to win over supporters of Marine Le Pen. And that's not been lost on officials in the region. Actually, Algerian civil society members have kind of been pointing to the fact that the feud with Algeria and Mali at the same time is part of a broader trend of kind of stoking Islamophobia for electoral purposes. So
and we're going to pick up on that point in part 2 of our discussions. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Yeah. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Fake.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're seeing the French ambassador summoned in Bamako amid deteriorating ties between Paris and the junta in Mali. We're talking about it with retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French mission, the French military mission to the United Nations, Niagalé Bagayoko, founder of the African Security Sector Network. From Oxford, Samuel Romani, researcher at Oxford University, and from London, Paul Melly, who is at the Africa program at the think tank Chatham House. Paul Melly, who in part 1 of our discussion was saying how Bamako's warming ties with Russia explain in part this deterioration of the relations between Mali and its former colonial power. Yeah, there's been talk, and it hasn't been denied, that a private security firm called Wagner, under the wing of a Putin protege, Evgeny Prigozhin, Wagner is in a bid to have a contract with the junta. Wagner, which first made headlines in Syria, before Libya and the Central African Republic. Haxi Myers-Belkin has more.
For Amnesty International, they're Vladimir Putin's secret army. Made up of between 2,500 and 5,000 Russian and foreign mercenaries, since 2014 the Wagner Group has, according to this investigation, operated in global conflicts where the Kremlin has strategic interests.
What's the main goal of any private military company? To defend the interests of a government if it can't use the regular army. The goal is financial revenue and the possibility of taking control of a large market for oil resources for our country.
The group's present in 12 countries around the world, but first emerged in Ukraine, where its mercenaries fought alongside pro-Russian separatists, ultimately assisting in Moscow's annexation of Crimea. Its contractors have since fought alongside the Syrian National Army in the country's civil war, bolstered forces and delivered weapons to rebel General Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and provided security to embattled presidents in Venezuela and the Central African Republic. In 2019, they also helped repress demonstrations against Sudanese strongman Omar al-Bashir. In return, the group gets cash and, in some countries rich in oil, gold and diamonds, extraction rights. The group's methods, meanwhile, have alarmed the UN and several NGOs, with Wagner contractors accused of carrying out executions, rapes and torture in the course of their missions. The assassination of 3 journalists investigating the group's activities in the Central African Republic in 2018, only adding to their concerns. Russian authorities have repeatedly denied that Wagner contractors carry out their orders. Photographs and testimony from Wagner's own mercenaries prove it does.
Samuel Romani, is Bamako really that close to signing a deal with Wagner?
So I think that Mali has certainly viewed Russia as a potential security alternative partner ever since the beginning. So Russia has been aware of that. So even during Operation Serval, the Russians were very willing to lash out at the French and the Americans for overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya and causing this problem, and they supported it. But already the Russians were trying to appeal to anti-French elements within Malian civil society, within the Malian military, through a protracted disinformation campaign to basically say that the French were in there to take uranium and other resources. Then in 2019, they signed a security agreement with them. And then in December of 2020, they signed another agreement allowing for the shipment of weaponry and equipment, which is why the helicopters moved last week. So the Russians have been cultivating pretty close ties within the Malian civil society and the Malian military for some time. So I suspect that the negotiations on the Wagner Group's deployment probably predated just earlier this month. They aren't a sudden development. They are a combination. They are a product of this.
But what's in it for Bamako, bringing in these foreign mercenaries when there are 4,000 plus French soldiers, plus the UN that's there? What's in it for them?
So obviously there's a lot of distrust and disillusionment with the French in the Operation Barkhane mission. And I think that there's also a growing amount of civil society pressure where people are just not necessarily pro-Russian or pro-Chinese when they hold those Russians and Chinese flags, but they certainly are critical of the French approach. There's a bit of a romanticization of the strong state approach to counterterrorism that Russia used in Syria and the application of the Syrian model towards Mali. That's appealing to it. So I think that that's part of what's driving them. But obviously, I think that the Malian courtship of Russia is really based on illusions. The Wagner Group have been effective in guarding stationary facilities, for example, in eastern Libya. They've been effective in providing logistical assistance in Syria. But when it comes to their forward combat missions, they've had a track record of failure. Their offenses on Tripoli were ended disastrously with the not being unable to defeat Turkey. They failed spectacularly in Cabo Delgado and Mozambique. They've helped the Central African Republic keep Bangui, but they haven't really been able to defeat the ex-Seleka rebels. So I think that the Malians, civil society and some of the Malian military are falling for some of the bluff and disinformation that Russia's pushing. And there really isn't much hard evidence to back up that they're going to really gain something big from it.
Niagalé Bagayoko, what would be the mission for Wagner?
That's what is not clear, because one of the main problems, in fact, is that Wagner has definitely no legal status. That's what is making things very complicated, because, in fact, even in the Central African Republic, it's almost impossible to know what kind of agreement has been signed first between, on the one hand, between the Central African authorities and the Russian ones, and then between the Central African authorities and those private securities companies. So that is one of the problems. So there is probably an expectation to see such private military groups.
We heard Samuel give one possible mission, which is to annoy the French.
That's the first thing, because from the very beginning, there has been rumors saying that maybe the Malian diplomacy was trying to make a bluff, just to show the French that they were able to speak loudly on the international scene and to make pressure for not having the French to leave too quickly the country. But what is very important is also to say that the Russian-Malian relationship are very old. Russia is not a new player in Mali because the first leader of Mali, Modibo Keïta, in fact asked the French colonial forces to leave the country and made a military agreement with the former USSR. And this has been lasting for 30 years. So, and again in 2012 and again in 2090s under Ibeka and ATT, there were also agreements which were passed between Mali and Russia. So the question is, would it be possible to have an agreement with Russia itself, which will involve also private military companies?
How would this go, Dominique Trinquant, you building on your experience at the UN, how would this work with, the French have been clear, if they come, we go.
Yeah.
How would the United Nations with its peacekeeping force react to this?
I mean, you've got the problem in CAR, where you've got a peacekeeping force and you've got Wagner present. And currently there are reports which say that be careful, UN can't work with a force like that close to them. To go back to the relation with the Russian, just keep it in three pieces, please. The first thing is the relation between the old relation, which was at that time ideological. It was the Soviet, it was communist, after the independence of Mali, against the former colony. Currently, it's no longer a communist, it's no longer ideology. It's just probably to annoy the French. That's the first thing. And that's the link between Russia. Second thing, with Wagner. Wagner, as I say, it's not an agreement with Russia. It's just mercenaries. We've got very low means. I mean, you've got soldier with light weapon, that's it. And you can't take the play. And for me, for Malian, it will be a shame to show that they need that sort of soldier because the army is not able to do the job. What's the problem? Malian, you've got a problem. If your army is not able to do the job, you ask mercenary to come. It's a shame for your army. And instead of making a coup like the lieutenant did, you need to fight and not to try to have a political position. And the last bit, the third one, is buying weapons. There is no problem. I mean, they prefer to buy helicopters from the Russian. It's normal job. I mean, they need this helicopter, they buy it. You've got no problem with that. So the real problem is that if they want to have an agreement with Russia, no problem. If they've got an agreement with the mercenaries, this is a real problem because it shows that the Malian army is not able to do the job and they are paying mercenary to do the job and they will not control the mercenary like it is in CAR.
Paul Melly, how do you read this, these negotiations?
Well, I think it's very difficult to know what's going on in the private negotiations between the government and Wagner. But I think there is a real risk because the whole of the strategy, the way that both France, but also the Malian army and also the other countries in the Sahel, the G5, the Niger, Burkina, Mauritania, Chad even, the way they are trying to evolve the strategy is to basically move away from using very heavy military means, except where there are moments of crisis and fighter jets or something have to be deployed, and to move more and more into soldiers from the Sahelian countries themselves working with the communities at local level, while the international special forces or the French anti-terrorist forces or whatever are in the background and providing high-tech backup just when it's needed.
High-tech backup meaning drones.
Missions. And that working with the communities is in response to a recognition that this isn't in Mali simply a war between a group of Al-Qaeda or ISIS ideologues and a legitimate state. It's also complicated by all sorts of local tensions, local pressures, interethnic problems, for example, in central Mali between Pearl cattle herders and Dogon farmers, and similar sort of problems in the tri-border area near the border with Niger and Burkina. And to deal with these local problems, you need local soldiers who are sensitive to local concerns. And one of the reasons for the French recalibration of strategy is actually a recognition that in dealing with local communities, it's that sort of local engagement that's very helpful. And that's the kind of thing for which Wagner mercenaries would be completely ill-equipped, because they obviously are not only not West African, but they don't speak either the local languages or probably mostly French. They have no experience of the local community issues. There's no development dimension to what they're doing. And so that also explains one of the reasons why ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc, has been absolutely categoric in condemning these negotiations. In an ECOWAS summit on the 16th of September, in the formal summit communique, they firmly condemned any negotiation between Mali and any agreement between Mali and private military contractors, because they, as West African leaders, can see the destabilization that this could bring. And of course, it's also complicated because the leaders of the constitutional governments in West Africa are already unnerved, if you like. They're very uncomfortable with the present Malian government because it came to power through a coup and appears to be procrastinating over the process of restoring electoral politics.
Right, procrastinating. And again, it's this, it gets back to this notion, Niagalé Bagayoko, listening to Paul Melly, that there is this Afghanistan effect. You can win militarily, but then you have to, as well, find political solutions. And does the junta have a firm grasp on that? Because that was an accusation often leveled at Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta before he was deposed in that coup.
No, I think that those who do not have a political approach to the crisis is more the international partner rather than the Malian authorities. We can definitely not agree with the solutions they have been trying to promote, including dialogue and negotiation, but it's difficult to say that there has been absolutely no political approach. And when we see in what you saw a few minutes ago about the force commander Michon and the declaration of the French president, you can see that there is a big gap between the technical, operational approach to the crisis and the political one. And in my view, it has been also the failure in Afghanistan, because you can see, you're saying that I completely agree with you that Russian mercenary will definitely not be able to fight, as Samuel was saying, nor to help and to train. But have the French be really able to improve the level of the Malian army? If today the Malian army is thinking about new partners, we also do have to wonder if there not has been some failures from our part.
In part one of our discussion, we were talking about how there's a domestic calculus on all sides. And again, this summoning of the French ambassador to Mali comes hot on the heels of the summoning of the French ambassador to Algeria less than a week ago. His foreign minister happened to visit Bamako on Tuesday. Ramtan Lamramra seizing the chance to take aim at their common former colonial power, thanking his neighbors, Mali, for their help back in 1960 during the Algerian War of Independence, and telling France to decolonize its own history, a rebuttal to remarks that the French president made over the weekend amid a visa row.
Our foreign partners need to decolonize their own history. They need to free themselves of certain attitudes, certain behaviors, certain worldviews, which are intrinsically linked to the incoherent logic of the West's claim to its civilizing mission.
All right, I don't want to get into a discussion about the relations between France and Algeria because we're running short on time, but it just gives a sense that it's all happening around the same time. Algeria rowing with France, France rowing with Mali, a president who's soon on the campaign trail, Emmanuel Macron, who, in that long interview that we heard a clip from at the beginning of the show, called on the Malian state to take charge of its own destiny. And he was asked about that current row with Algeria.
There will inevitably be further tensions, but I think that my obligations are to facilitate these efforts because we owe it to our youth and to so many millions of our fellow citizens. And I think that our inability to face this history head-on is the source of a lot of problems in our relationship with the African continent.
So, couching it as trying to revisit history in a more dispassionate manner, be it Mali or Algeria. Niagalé Bagayoko, do you agree with Emmanuel Macron there?
There is a need to have a more quiet and constructive approach in African and French relationship, of course. But I'm not sure that today what the French president has said is a way to develop such an approach, because you know how sensitive are the Algerian authorities and Algerian people as well as regards the relations with France. And there is also a need not to forget how involved is Algeria in the management of the Malian crisis as well, especially as regards the northern part of the country. So the play at stake might be somewhat dangerous in my view.
And for Emmanuel Macron, it's an open question. Is the calculus about as well all those dual nationals who will be voting next April in presidential elections here in France?
Of course, there is a link with the election. But let's be clear, there was an agreement with Algeria to work on the history and to put forward certain things. France did it, Algeria did nothing. And at the end of the day, I think that France is fed up of pushing the Algerians to do something, and they are never doing something. And certainly it was not very diplomatic to put forward the fact that the Algerian power is playing on the colonial past and the guerre d'indépendance. I've been myself in Algeria, it's everywhere. And when you are talking with Algerian citizens, they say, don't, it's not a problem, it's only the leaders who are talking about that. We are not talking about that.
And when it comes to Mali?
For Mali, it's different. I mean, when we say that it's up to the Malian government, but a government, not what's happening currently. It's not a government, a coup inside a coup. So a Malian government must take in charge the change inside with the Accord d'Alger, of course, and to take in charge the reorganization of Mali, which is not happening currently and have not been happening for several years.
All right, much more to talk about. We could go on for much longer. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you, General Trinquant. I want to thank as well Niagalé Bagayoko, Samuel Romani in Oxford, Paul Melly in London. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.